Welcome back to Be a Better Leader. I'm Jeffery Downs, a managing director at Franklin Covey, the world's most trusted leadership company. We're here today to share with you one of the key principles you need to be an effective communicator as a manager and leader. For longtime listeners, the connection between communication and trust will not be a new idea. But establishing trust is so vital in our efforts to communicate effectively that we knew we needed to continue this conversation right here today. We're lucky to welcome a longtime member of the Speed of Trust practice and co-author of the book, Trust and Inspire, How Truly Great Leaders Unleash Greatness in Others. And I loved the book. It was absolutely fantastic. Mr. David Kasperson, welcome. We're so glad to have you.
Hey, Jeff. Thank you very much. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, it's great to be with you as well. I'm so excited about what we have to talk about today. And as an introduction to this, I just wanted to ask you, where did your passion for the whole subject of trust come? I mean, where did it start and where did it come into being?
I honestly, I think probably like most people, by being trusted. I grew up in an environment with, good family, good friends, good kind of space, a lot of very normal kinds of things. And when I was in college, I had a teacher who just saw potential in me for no reason that I could figure out, but believed in me and kind of took me under her wing. And that belief in me, she communicated. She told me that she saw potential, saw that there's some areas that again were tied to the class. It was a public speaking class of all things. And she thought that I had some opportunity going down this path. And then a couple of years after the class, she came and tracked me down and said, "Hey, I know this guy. His name's Stephen M.R. Covey, and he's working on a book." And she's like, "I think it's called The Speed of Integrity," or something like that. At the time, it was about a little more than a year before the book came out. And at the time, our team was quite small. It was about 6 of us, and just introduced me to Stephen, who I connected with really well right up front. And I remember the very first conversation I had with him, he had done something like this. It was a conference call where he'd taken a bunch of questions, and he came down the stairs. We were in this kind of, little 2-level cottage office thing at the time. And he came down the stairs after doing this call, taking a bunch of questions on the topic of trust. And my mind was just swimming. And he sat down and asked, "So, hey, what did you think of the call?" And I was kind of taken aback. I was interviewed by somebody else on the team, so it was the first time I'd met him. And my first response was kind of like, "Well, gee, Mr. Covey, that was great." I just kind of didn't know what to say. He smiled and just kind of rolled with it, but he pressed me. And my mind started to shift to, why are you asking me this? Like, there were hundreds of people on this call asking you to hear about this topic. Like, I couldn't understand, honestly, why he was asking me, but he kept pressing. And I got this feeling like, he's not just going through the motions. My opinion matters to him. I didn't understand why, but it felt different. And all of a sudden, again, I think it was my second day on the job, all the things that I was worried about being capable for, competent for, things that I didn't know, I felt right off the bat that was all going to be fine because this guy trusts me. Doesn't mean that he thinks I'm perfect, but he thinks that my opinion, what I'm bringing to the table is of value. And that feeling just sparked something. And 18 years later, here we are.
Here we are. It's interesting that you mentioned about Stephen, and I've had interaction with him as well. And he truly does live the principles that he wrote about in Speed of Trust, and also that you and he wrote about in Trust and Inspire. So that leads me to the next question, which is, he set up a trusting environment. Where do untrusting environments, and if that's even a word, I tried to find another word for untrusting. There's really, you could say suspicion or something else like that.
Yeah.
But where do those come from, and what's the effect on communication?
Let me just add some nuance to the question too, because I actually really like that word, because my mind when I heard you say that right off the bat was, where do low trust environments come from? And low trust, when people think about that, that's kind of like a feeling. You're thinking about in just your level of maybe confidence and things, but an untrusting environment is not just where trust might be low, but people also just aren't giving it, which means that the trust is pretty low and it's probably going to stay there. So you asked where that comes from. I'd probably say learned experience. Most people, if you ask in a low trust environment of, hey, why is trust low here? They can usually give you several reasons. And a lot of those reasons will have a name attached to them that, hey, so-and-so did this, or so-and-so's done this, or they've got stories, they've got narratives, they've got examples that justify the low level of trust. And in most cases, they're totally accurate. They know something happened before, and so they're using that to look forward again to what's going to happen now. What's interesting, though, is that generally all of the reasons that someone will give for trust to be low usually are outside in. They're usually, again, somebody else did this or something happened. It illustrates something really important, that one of the 13 behaviors, as you know, is 13 behaviors of high trust leaders is practice accountability. The opposite of that, of course, in this scenario, if you ask somebody why trust is low, is they would just say no accountability. Hey, it's not my fault. Don't look at me. The counterfeit, which is what shows up when trust tends to be low in most of these behaviors, is that might be described when somebody ascribes accountability for the low trust environment to someone else, which is what I just described. They would say, well, trust is low and it's because of so-and-so, because of so-and-so, because of so-and-so. The actual behavior of someone we're practicing accountability, and I've seen this. There's an executive team we were working with where there was a brand new CEO, and trust was low, and we were trying to understand some of the root causes of it. And we'd asked about it, and he says, well, it's low because I haven't been here very long and had much time to change anything. He wasn't asking the question on his end of why is trust low. He was asking the question of how can I create more trust? And usually I think why it's low is you've got a group of people who are kind of stuck in valuing maybe what happened before without anybody really stepping to or choosing to step forward and say, well, maybe I can change that. Which I think is a powerful turning point.
I think that is powerful. As you were talking and I was listening about, low trust is, and I think the way that you said it is there's usually a name attached to it in some way, that there was an experience that they had with an individual that created this low trust environment. And for you to be able to help with this CEO identify and say, okay, how do we start to now build that trust? That brings about a dynamic, which is a question that I want to actually lead into, which is when you have a dynamic of a CEO to those who report to the CEO or manager to employee, those are different type of trusting dynamics, aren't they? I mean, it's as you look at that, if I'm talking with the CEO, I'm feeling a little bit different than if I'm talking with a peer, and there's different levels of trust. Is that making sense? And am I on track there as far as
it totally makes sense. Some of it boils down to power dynamics and naturally the way we tend to think about things. And I hear people talk about this all the time. And been asked this question where, well, doesn't leadership start at the top? Really, if you don't have leaders modeling high trust behavior or modeling trust, you'll never have it inside the organization. Isn't that the way that it works? And I think that can be the way that it works, which is really, by the way, great news for the leader, because you are in a position where you are kind of expected, you are clearly expected to lead and have the opportunity to do so. It might feel like maybe a more natural starting point. If you look at, if I'm in a relationship where I'm the boss, I can choose to direct this conversation however I want to go. That dynamic changes in maybe a peer-to-peer relationship where maybe there's not a position of formal authority or formal positional strength where we're more kind of leveled out. A lot of us too also find ourselves in a scenario where trust might be low and we're on the lower rung of the hierarchy in the organization or in the structure. So maybe I think the context absolutely matters, but I also don't think the context determines the outcome. I might say it makes a difference not really in what you can or can't accomplish. It just really makes a difference in what your starting point is. Because sometimes we'll be asked this question again where the dynamic might be, again, reversed, where you're on the lower end and people will say, well, look, my boss doesn't trust anybody. Trust has always been low here. I don't know what to do about it. I mean, can I manage my boss? How do I do that? The short answer is no, you can't manage your boss. It's really hard. It would be a really hard thing to try to be able to do. but you can lead your boss. You can influence your boss. As you know, we position leadership not so much as a function of your position, but leadership is a choice, and
Hmm.
leaders go first. That might be kind of what gets us trapped in thinking, well, leaders go first. That means the formal leader needs to go first. No, if I'm going first, I am leading. Um, if I want to grow trust with somebody else, especially somebody who doesn't trust other people, that's something that I can start with on my own.
Okay. So now with all of that as a backdrop, and I appreciate you going into that, I want to focus a little bit more in on communication and give me a little bit about if, and this may be obvious, but I think that it's important to pull out. If trust is high, communication probably flows a little bit more easily. Whereas if trust is low, communication is very difficult. Now, that may be really
Yeah.
obvious, but the question that I really want to ask is when trust is low and I need to communicate, how do I what do I do as a manager to kind of shift the balance so that communication can flow again using the principles of trust?
Yeah, I love that. Sometimes that question gets asked of like, well, what are the things that I say? And that's it's hard to answer because in the same way that it affects communication, it also affects the same things that you say. I could give you a phrase, but if you don't trust me and I say something to you, you're not going to buy it no matter what it is that I say, no matter what words I use, no matter how eloquent I am. It's just not going to work. On the flip side, you kind of find that, and that when trust is low, you could be very measured and precise in your communication, and it won't matter just because people won't believe you. If trust is high, on the other hand, like you described, you can almost say the wrong thing and even miscommunicate, and people will still either get your meaning or give you the benefit of the doubt because they trust you. It fills in that gap that might be there. So if you're in a position where the trust might be lower, a couple of maybe good tips. First is really to start with yourself, and that's your own credibility, your own behavior. Are you giving to this person somebody, a leader that they can trust? And do they know that they can trust you? Obviously, if trust is low, maybe they don't know. Ask yourself the question, well, am I credible? And we look at 4 cores and 13 behaviors that kind of help us shape some of that. But really, it starts with asking the question, am I credible? Am I giving somebody they can trust? And if that's true, then I add to it behavior. I would say start with declaring your intent. Declare your intent. People can't see it. If they don't hear it, they don't know it, they're guessing. And that's the difference in a high trust relationship. When people don't know your intent, they're guessing positively. In a low trust relationship, people don't know your intent. They're usually playing out or projecting their worst case fears, scenarios, or lived experiences with other people in your position. And you're paying a trust tax that somebody else started long, long before you even got here. So I'd start with getting your intent clear. Now, also recognize if trust is really, really low, even if you declare your intent, they might not believe you. And that's fine. You kind of got to be ready for that. I would add to that the behavior of making and keeping commitments. So start with yourself, declare your intent, and make and keep commitments. See, because when you make a commitment and keep it, you build trust, even if it's a small thing. You do
Yeah.
that again, you
Yeah.
build a little more trust. You do that again, you build a little more trust. The opposite, of course, is you make commitments and break them, and you lose trust real fast. You do that once or twice, and you might not
And
even
then
get
it's
it.
over anyway.
And if you make a commitment and you kind of keep it, or I don't know, maybe not quite all the way, you kind of counterfeit it, you're kind of losing ground at that point. But make, keep,
Yeah.
repeat. Look for ways to make and keep meaningful commitments.
Really love that because when individuals, people, leaders, whatever it is, making and keeping the commitments to themselves, that really rings true to me because if I don't trust myself, then my ability to extend trust, I think, goes down. Would that be a correct statement?
Oh, totally. And Jeff, you're a master on this. I've heard you talk on this before, the idea of how you make and keep commitments to yourself, building streaks, getting things right over time, significant promises that you make to yourself. You build immense credibility when you do that. And it also changes the way that you make commitments to other people because your confidence in keeping them is so high because you've got so many of those to build upon for yourself.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Really loving this conversation, David. I want to ask you in regards to building trust within your team. we live in this whole hybrid world now where there's a lot of this communication where you and I are talking over a camera and through a microphone. And then there's still, hopefully, the in-person communication. Do you see a difference between the two in building trust? And if there's a difference, what is it? And how would you recommend really building that trust in either environment?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a difference for sure. In the past, I'd have maybe responded just with, doing things virtually, collaborating, communication, doing all those things virtually. In the past, I might have described that as it's like the Olympic metaphor of you increase the difficulty of the dive. Like you still do it, you still accomplish it, but it's a variable that makes it just a little bit harder. And in some ways, I think I kind of learned that it makes it still a little bit easier. There was a college president in Canada that we're working with this last year who kind of illuminated this for me. He'd been president for 12 years, knew his staff, knew his team really, really well, had really strong relationships of trust with all of them. And one of the things he told us in preparation for this meeting, it was the first time they'd gotten all together as a team since COVID. And he said, let me tell you just what's been the biggest gift from COVID. Because COVID really was a gift. Now, if you're running, a college that has 4 different campuses, I don't know that you'd look at that as a gift during that time because it just upsets everything about your reality. But he says, what shifted for me was we started having, these are people who had been in my office forever. We'd all known each other. We all spent hours and hours together face to face, which has been fantastic. But when we started having our virtual meetings, something that shifted in my paradigm was you would see each other on the screen, but you were seeing them and they would be in their homes. And so you would see behind them, some artwork on the wall, or a pet would run by, or a kid would interrupt the call, or some other thing that would happen. He said, I never think of my employees as just employees, but seeing them in that setting, because I'd never seen them in that setting before, it just kind of changed my paradigm and helped me to see them more as a person instead of an employee. And you ask anybody he worked for, nobody would think that he doesn't see them as a person. But it allowed for a level of connection that was facilitated by the disconnection of not being everywhere and seeing everything. Wow. So I'd look at it in the sense of, it's different. And it may not be that it's harder. It really is just different. I mean, even as you know, we have different modalities for delivering training. There are things we can do in a virtual setting that we can't do in a physical setting. I mean, if you ever tried to break 200 people up into breakout rooms instead of a ballroom, it's a madhouse. But you do that on a virtual setting, and all of a sudden you're able to create these intimate 3, 4, 5 person conversations. So I think I don't know that it's harder or worse. I think we've got to be open to the idea of disrupting ourselves a little bit and finding ways to get creative. I think the only key to doing that, though, is if we do have trust. Because interestingly enough, that same president, if he were having a call with somebody on his team where there was low trust, I guarantee you they would have found the most silent corner in their home where they couldn't be disrupted, couldn't have any noise, couldn't have anything else going on. And it would be just the same kind of thing, less feeling than maybe being in face-to-face. But when you have trust, again, when these things come up and pop up, it's usually the question of, well, how can we make more out of this rather than, boy, how do we compensate for not being able to do what we want to do? High trust environment,
David,
more innovative and creative.
Yeah, highly insightful. I mean, as you talked about being able to peer into someone's home and see who they are in the home environment, that gives you a different level of understanding about that individual than it does when you're in the office environment. I mean, that is just highly insightful. Thank you for sharing that. That's amazing.
But again, if trust is low, it won't happen that way. You won't see it.
Right. Yeah, that's so true. Well, unfortunately, we're running out of time here. I just have one more question, and then we're going to have to call it wraps. I'd love to keep going on with this because there's so much more that we could go into. In the case of a disagreement, okay, you disagree with someone on your team, whatever it is that's potentially a realm of not trusting someone or increasing trust. I mean, it could go either way.
Yeah.
How do you see that in a disagreement where you can actually, in the disagreement, build trust?
Yeah, I'll give you two quick responses. The first is to go back and listen to the rest of the episodes in this series. This gets covered
Okay.
beautifully by each of the people you spoke with, particularly Stephen, when he talks about innovation and navigating differences, but in an environment of trust. Um,
Yeah.
what really makes disagreements valuable, though, is when you're really opening to hearing and understanding. Usually people will see them as kind of speed bumps to getting to a predetermined destination of what they want to get done and accomplished. So I love the speed of trust framework. There's two behaviors in there that I would go back to for this. And we talk about this all the time, whether it be cultural differences or fundamental disagreements, or anytime you just see things differently, not seeing them as a frustration, but being curious. And the behaviors I'd pick would be: listen first, and then demonstrate respect for what you hear. And you'll notice that I didn't add any kind of a response in there. It's listen first and demonstrate respect for what you hear. The counterfeit, of course, would listen first would be to really not be paying attention, or to listen just so you can. I think AJ mentioned this in one of the interviews in this session. She talked about listening just so you can reply. Listen to understand, and for demonstrate respect, the counterfeit to watch out for there. I really think the counterfeit of respect might be best described as deference, where I'm patient with somebody, I'm open, I'm approachable, and I might be making the space comfortable, but in my heart and mind, I'm not really hearing them. I'm not really respecting, honoring the things that they're putting out. Again, I might be being polite, and that's a good thing too. Mm-hmm. But really demonstrating a level of honor and appreciation for what they're bringing, even if I disagree with it.
Yeah. David, again, highly insightful. Love everything that you've taught us today, and I appreciate it. And I look at it, and if people went away from this 20 minutes with what you have said, it's not only going to increase their trust, it's going to help them in the difficult conversations, it's going to help them in disagreements, it's going to help them really become a better leader and manager. So thank you for that. For anyone who would like to learn more approaches for improving trust and communication, download our free guide, 6 Communication Practices to Build Trust and Inspire Your Team. You can find a link to it in the show notes, or visit franklincovey.com for more information and resources. Until we talk again, keep smiling.